Great, thanks. Good to be here, David. Okay. Well, it's so important, especially because the schools, there's no real systematic approach to teaching the philosophy or the history. So you get different students are getting different historical stories, different historical facts, and different emphasis from, across the board. So chiropractic students are sort of at a loss in some degree because they're learning one thing what needs to be remembered for the boards, like the date 1895 and there were 33 principles and that kind of stuff. But they don't really get the juice, they're not really getting where we came from. And if you don't know where you came from, how can you really build a profession in the future? Because that's what I think students, they don't necessarily get the importance of the role they're going to play in the future of the profession. So the stories from the past, sometimes it seems like, why do I need to learn that old stuff that happened 100 years ago? Right. But it's really an amazing thing when you can start to see that you come from a tradition, you come from a story, and you come from a struggle. Like the chiropractic story, the chiropractic history is really an amazing event. There's really been nothing like it in the history of America and definitely in the world, of a profession that just kind of showed up, a healing profession that just kind of showed up out of the blue and was able to stay and become a real profession. Does that make sense? Because there was all the other sort of healing modalities that arrived at the end of the 19th century, they all fell to the wayside. There's not really any of them besides osteopathy that have really, especially, and osteopathy merged with medicine. So there was no real distinct profession that became its own professional body. So learning how that happened, I think it's a crime for students to not understand how we got here. Oh yeah, great. Well, Didi, he was quite an eclectic character. He there's lots of good stories. His practice, he saw like 100 people a day at one point in his practice. So he had the first sort of high volume practice in chiropractic. A lot of people don't realize, they when they think of D.D. Palmer, especially people who sort of write him off, or don't acknowledge the real impact that he had on the profession. They don't realize what an accomplished physiologist and anatomist he was. There's one great paper written a few years ago in the Journal of Chiropractic History. And by the way, I recommend all students, it's probably the best investment you could make as a student is to become a member of the Association for Chiropractic History. I think it's like $45 for the year and you get two journals. Anyway, that's a side note. But D.D. Palmer, he what they did was they looked at his book, and sorry I digress from your question, but they looked at his book and they wanted to see what was he studying? Like what were the references he was using in anatomy and physiology? And they found that the references he used in his 1910 book were comparable and even more advanced than the references that were being used by medical students in a 100-mile radius of all the medical schools. And he was self-taught. So the guy was really phenomenal. Probably one of my favorite stories. He was in court and he had to sort of defend chiropractic. He had a student, and from what I've read, it seemed like it was a setup. There was a student who demanded his money back, and there's a real allegation out there that this student was sort of a plant from the medical doctors in Davenport at the time that were trying to get rid of all of the non-medical healers. So this one student, he complained that, I didn't learn anything. I want my money back. And D.D. Palmer said, get off my campus. You're not getting your money back. I taught you everything I know. You paid your $500. So the guy wouldn't leave. So D.D. called the paddy wagon and they brought him to jail. And he basically got imprisoned without any charge. So the guy brought up charges against D.D. Palmer for wrongful imprisonment. It's kind of a weird story. And then when Dee Dee did end up, then Dee Dee left town pretty much after that for a while, and he was back and forth. But when Dee Dee got arrested in 1906 and he was at his trial, they wanted to understand what chiropractic was. And his response was something like, I'm not going to tell you for a 50-cent witness what people pay me $500 for, basically. So, and then he went to jail and he ended up serving, I think, 23 days in prison, which was, unfortunate and really changed the course of the history. Yeah, well, BJ, there's lots of stories, and I've written about his life because in his life, you can see that he went through different phases from his early days to the development of chiropractic to, and then he became a publisher. He published the Green Books, and then he became a real entrepreneur. He was a researcher. He traveled the world in the 1920s, which is a pretty fascinating story in itself. And he's written a couple books just on that topic. I think for BJ, it's important for people to get that he was constantly growing and evolving, and especially that thing you bring up with the court cases. BJ's counsel at the time was Tom Morris. And Morris, he was he was the legal counsel for the UCA, which was the first protective organization. And he counseled that chiropractors should go to jail if charges were brought up against them, and they should argue the legal case in court and have a jury. Ideally, they wanted a jury because the juries were most sympathetic. And then they were able to have a case-by-case movement to make chiropractic legal. And he felt that that was a more effective strategy than having chiropractic boards and having legislation passed, because he felt that over a few generations, the chiropractors would change. And there would be chiropractors who didn't care so much about the original ideals of chiropractic and the focus on adjusting the vertebral subluxation as the core focus of chiropractic. So he thought if there were case-by-case legal statutes, it would be much better in the long run than having state boards dictate the profession. So there was a real controversy at the time. The other schools, by the 1920s, there were really these two camps, and one was pushing more towards developing a legal strategy with boards, and the other camp had this slogan of "go to jail for chiropractic," which was, pretty successful for the time. One of the interesting stories from BJ, if a chiropractor went to jail, he would have all the students write letters to the chiropractor in jail. So there was this one story of a chiropractor in San Francisco who got so much mail that the postal workers in San Francisco went on strike because they were just tired of carrying bags and bags of mail. And if the chiropractor who was imprisoned was within a day train ride from Davenport, the whole student body would hop on the train and people would go visit them in prison. So, and there's some really powerful stories too of chiropractors who did go to jail and their lives were destroyed. I mean, their practices, they had no income. I mean, part of BJ's UCA was to give like $100 a month to the families. But there were chiropractors who just they couldn't feed their families. You know, there's some real tragic stories. So that's another reason why it's really important for chiropractors to know that the the rights they have today were really earned by chiropractors who fought for their lives to make chiropractic a separate and distinct profession. Good question. Yeah. Yeah, I would say, get your hands on people from as early as you can and really get a sense of what it feels like to just put your hands on people. One of my teachers, Graham Dobson, he teaches in New Zealand now, and he taught me years ago, and I was amazed when he said when he got out of school, he followed a chiropractor around for a year, and all the guy let him do was touch people's necks before and after adjustments for like a year. And then after 10 years, he thought he was really good at palpating. And when he taught me, he had been practicing for 20 years, and he just thought, now I know I can get much better, you know. So just start getting your hands on people and definitely study the philosophy because it's really the cornerstone. Yeah, my pleasure.